As 1992 began, the Wild Cowboys were under heavy investigation for various crimes, most notably for the quad murders in December of 1991, as well as for the May 1991 murder of college student David Cargill. With boss Lenny Sepulveda incarcerated on a gun charge, he was still running things from prison. At the same time that the heat was coming down on the gang, the beef between Lenny and Frankie Cuevas was exploding on the streets of the Bronx and Washington Heights. On January 3, 1992, a man came to the hole at 348 Beekman Avenue to purchase 5 bundles of crack from Nelson, and after Nelson believed that some of the bills he gave him were counterfeit, he and Stanley Tukes followed him back to his car and both shot him dead.
This murder just inflamed the scorching heat already coming down on Beekman Avenue, and police were constantly surveilling activity around the hole. Workers here would often get arrested, and business began to decline drastically, which led the Orange Top spot around the corner to see a big increase in sales activity.
Due to witness statements, Daniel Shorty Gonzalez and Stanley Tukes were arrested in late January for the quad murders. Cops were also now hot on the trail of the man known as Platano, who drove a white BMW like the one Cargill's passengers saw chasing them.
The confidential informant from Washington Heights also told them that Platano hid contraband in secret compartments, and an APB was put out on a dark-skinned Dominican named Platano who drove a white BMW. In the next few weeks, detectives uncovered that Platano's real name was Wilfredo de Los Angeles. On January 29, 1992, police followed Platano in his white BMW to a car shop in New Jersey and pulled him over. They searched the secret compartments in his vehicle and found 10 ounces of cocaine, a loaded gun, and several bags of weed.
For his history of violence, Platano surprisingly had no record of arrests, and cops alleged that he acted like a scared child when he was taken into custody. Soon after his arrest, he gave a statement to Detective Dugan about the Cargill murder and named Lenny as the shooter and Frankie Cuevas as the driver.
This was the first time that Manhattan detectives had learned that a man named Lenny was the boss of a crack dealing operation on Beekman Avenue in the Bronx. 3 days later, Platano was released on $45,000 bail, and detectives went up to Ogdensburg Correctional Facility to speak with Lenny, but they failed to obtain any relevant information from him. Then the investigation took a big downturn when the original witnesses to the quad began recanting their statements after being threatened or assaulted by Cowboys members.
By this time, Frankie Cuevas had become extremely paranoid and suspicious of all of those close to him. When he drove by West 171st Street in the Heights and saw his underling Madonna speaking with some Cowboys members who simply happened to be old friends of his, he became convinced that he was selling him out to his enemies.
On February 1st, 1992, 22-year-old Danny Madonna Matia's dead body was found along the West Side Highway near the West 178th Street exit. He had been shot twice in the head and run over by a car. He was last seen at the 20 de Mayo restaurant with Frankie Cuevas. The next month, on March 16, 1992, Frankie was in a car with his trusted soldier, Manny Garcia, stopped at a red light at this very intersection, West 185th Street and Audubon Avenue. Gilbert Camposano was in another car close behind them. That's when a car occupied by Freddy Krueger and Platano pulled up next to Frankie and began firing. Frankie was struck in his left arm and wrist and took off running down West 185th Street, while Manny was struck in his arm and back. Frankie ran to the 34th Precinct for help and told the police that he believed his friend Manny was dead, but when they returned to the scene, they found him clinging to life, and both he and Frankie were taken to the hospital. When detectives later went to the hospital, they learned that Manny Garcia survived, but he had been paralyzed. When they interviewed him, they tried to stir Manny up to identify the shooters, saying that he is paralyzed for the rest of his life while his assailants are free. But Manny was unrattled and unwilling to cooperate, saying that he would just accept his fate and Frankie would take care of him. Cuevas checked himself out of the hospital the following night.
A few days later, on March 20th, at close to 1 a.m., Gilbert Camposano staggered into the Columbian Presbyterian Hospital on West 168th Street, bleeding profusely from gunshot wounds to his face and right hand, and was quickly escorted to undergo surgery. There was a trail of blood that followed him from the street into the hospital. When detectives arrived, they followed that bloody trail and retraced his steps 6 blocks away from the hospital. And the trail eventually led them to 500 West 174th Street, then all the way up to an apartment on the 5th floor.
The apartment belonged to Frankie Cuevas' mother, and when they broke down the door, they found the floors covered in blood and several guns laying around. Clues from the scene told police the story of several men beating and interrogating one person before shooting them. Downstairs, another man entered the building and was stopped by detectives until he identified himself as a police officer from the 40th Precinct who had come to see his friend Frankie. This man was dirty cop Victor Nazar, who was also on Frankie's payroll, and the other detectives found this encounter very suspicious. It's believed that Frankie had Gilbert shot because when Gilbert didn't spring into action a few days earlier when he and Manny were ambushed, Frankie questioned if he set him up. During Gilbert's surgery, the part of the brain responsible for memory was removed, and when detectives came to interview him, he couldn't remember what happened and didn't even know he had been shot. The same night as Gilbert's shooting, a Red Top manager named Esteban Clemente, aka English, was here in the hole when a man named Marion Boogie Frazier attempted to rob him and shot him in the stomach. Critically wounded, he stumbled up to his apartment and told his wife Iris Cruz to get rid of a stash of money and drugs before the police arrived. Iris Cruz rented out her apartment as a stash house to the gang, and she gave the package to her son Tito to hide. 31-year-old Esteban English Clemente later died at the hospital, and Iris's sons, as well as her brother-in-law Edgar, made the unwise decision to split the stash amongst themselves, and they all went on shopping sprees. Soon, Pac and Frankie Robles tracked the stash to Iris's apartment, but Iris and her sons denied knowledge of the package. The next day, Pac pistol whipped Tito in front of the building. Fearing for their lives, the next day, Iris Cruz, Elizabeth Morales, and their children, Tito Cruz, Michael Cruz, Joey Morales, and little Iris Cruz, fled to a shelter in the middle of the night. In the spring of 1992, while Lenny was in prison, he had learned that El Feo's enemy, Mingolo, was back in town, and got the word to El Feo, who was also incarcerated. After learning the whereabouts of his hideout, on April 4th, 1992, Platano and Freddy were sent to stake it out. After Mingolo eventually emerged, he got into a gypsy cab, then was followed by 2 cars. One was occupied by Platano and Freddy, and the other by Raul Vargas and an accomplice named Maximo. They followed Mingolo across the McCombs Dam Bridge, but then hit traffic, and that's when Raul swung into the other lane to block the oncoming cars. Freddy then hopped out with 2 9mm, ran up to Mingolo's cab, and then unleashed a hail of bullets on him, splattering his brains all over the inside of the car. Platano then U-turned into the other lane, which was now free of traffic for them to speed away.
Less than 2 weeks later, Platano was in his car near West 191st Street and St. Nicholas Avenue when he noticed a black Pathfinder with tinted windows behind him. Suddenly, an armed man approached the driver's side and began shooting at him through the window. Platano then took off, and when he looked in the rearview mirror, he saw Frankie Cuevas with a gun. Platano was critically injured with wounds to his stomach, liver, and right arm, and when he made it to the hospital, doctors didn't think he would survive. When detectives came to interview him, he exclaimed how Frankie Cuevas had shot him, and later picked him out of a photo lineup.
2 weeks later, 3 masked men led by a kid named George Quinones were sent to Frankie's 20 de Mayo restaurant on St. Nicholas Avenue to burn it down. While several customers were still in the restaurant, one man blocked the exit with a gun, and the other doused the dining area with gasoline and then set it ablaze. 7 patrons and several employees escaped by throwing a table through the window. This arson was allegedly done to get Frankie angry, to lure him to Beekman Avenue, where several Cowboys members were waiting on the roof with guns to take him out, but Frankie never showed up. 5 days after the restaurant fire, the body of 19-year-old George Quinones was found shot dead in the northeast section of the Bronx. It's unknown if Quinones' murder was connected to the restaurant fire, as Quinones was also a stick-up kid and may have had his share of enemies who wanted him dead.
A few days after the 20 de Mayo blaze, there was a drive-by shooting at Cuevas' drug spot on Watson Avenue, which resulted in a man named John Soldi being killed and 7 others being wounded, 2 critically.
Elizabeth Morales called Mark Tebbens, telling him that her family could offer them evidence into the Wild Cowboys crimes, since Joey, Michael, and Tito worked for them.
But contrary to their claims, the Morales and Cruz kids never actually worked for the gang. They only occasionally ran low-level errands for certain gang members, like retrieving items for them from the corner store, but they were involved in their own criminal activities, like robbing drug customers. But Tebbens saw his opportunity, and soon the kids' involvement with the Wild Cowboys would be severely embellished and used to build a solid case against them.
From there on out, Tebbens placed the Cruz Morales family in various living arrangements under police protection. After coming under Tebbens' care, the kids began providing statements, as all of them just so happened to witness every top murder that Mark Tebbens himself was investigating, including the Quad and Cargill killings. Joey Morales, who was 11 at the time, claimed to be out getting milk for his mother and happened to stumble across the murders, while Michael Cruz said that he was out getting a cheeseburger at the time of the slayings.
Joey identified Fat Danny, Platano, Stanley, Shorty, and Renny as the assailants, and his brother Tito confirmed his version of events.
Despite Joey making 4 different statements about what he witnessed with the Quad, the 5 people he identified would be indicted for the slayings. With Shorty and Tukes already in custody, Platano was arrested in the hospital on May 13, 1992, while he was recovering from his gunshot wound a month earlier, and Fat Danny was arrested on June 6th. The highly questionable witness accounts from the Cruz Morales family would be crucial pieces for the investigation. Soon, a variety of other supposed eyewitnesses were gathered, and investigators were placing them in the right time and places that they needed them to be.
It's been said that Mark Tebbens particularly had it out for Fat Danny and was hell-bent on taking him down. Some believe that this may have been because Danny was known to be a wise guy who cracked jokes and had a smart mouth. El Feo was released from prison on May 22, 1992, and returned to dominating the heroin trade of the Heights and the South Bronx. El Feo's right-hand man was Hipólito Polanco, known as Hippie, who was the brother of Cowboys member David Polanco. While Feo was locked up, he ordered Freddy Krueger to gun down his 2 rivals, Morenito and Paelo, which resulted in Paelo being killed, but Morenito survived. So upon his release, Feo moved around very vigilantly, often with Krueger by his side, as he knew that Morenito was out for vengeance.
From November of 1991 to May 1992, there were 11 murders on or around Beekman Avenue, and Tebbens was using his cast of eyewitnesses to try and pin all of them on the Cowboys. On November 7, 1991, a man named Eddie Maldonado was stabbed to death in St. Mary's Park, and suddenly Joey Morales came forward as a witness to that crime as well, and implicated several Wild Cowboys members.
On June 21, 1992, Lenny was released from prison after serving 8 months and met up with his crew to discuss pending matters, mainly the problematic Frankie Cuevas. That very same night, there was a drive-by shooting at Frankie's drug spot at Manor and Watson, which killed a man named Kevin Nazario and wounded 5 others. 2 days later, on June 23rd, Freddy Krueger shot and killed an 18-year-old kid named Craig Prentice, who was a member of a Jamaican posse that was moving in on El Feo's turf near Andrews Avenue. Then on July 10th, Krueger was sent to take out the leader of the posse named Christopher Dredd Livingston, and he was gunned down in a hail of bullets as he sat in his car.
2 days later, on July 12th, El Feo was with Raul Vargas when he stopped at the bodega right behind me, which was also his headquarters, at 2172 Amsterdam Avenue in Washington Heights. Soon after El Feo entered the store, a man emerged from a double-parked sedan and shot him twice from behind. The first shot entered his stomach, and the second shot shattered his spine. As El Feo lay on the floor waiting for medics to arrive, he told Vargas that he couldn't feel his legs.
That day, he had taken his last steps, as the 22-year-old Jose El Feo Reyes would be paralyzed for the rest of his life. By now, Red Top sales at the Hole on Beekman Avenue had completely ceased, and the Orange Top operation nearby at 600 East 141st Street was generating most of their revenue. The gang still continued to earn good money, but their best days appeared to be behind them.
By the summer of 1992, Tesso and a partner of his named Batata had got involved with orange and red top sales in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn. A local dealer named Juan Francisco, aka Papito, had taken exception to their presence, and on one occasion he beat Tesso with a metal bar. Then on July 14, 1992, several men in a Maxima pulled up to Brighton's second place, and Pacolito and Tesso jumped out of the vehicle. Tesso then pointed out Papito to Pac, who then proceeded to shoot him 6 times, killing him on the spot. Witnesses identified one of the assailants as the man that they knew as Flaco, which was really Tesso.
With Frankie Cuevas' enemy Lenny now back on the streets and his paranoia escalating, especially when high on cocaine, he continued to be cautious of all of those around him.
After Frankie's amnesia-stricken former underling Gilbert Camposano rehabbed from his gunshot wound, which Frankie himself was behind, he began working for Frankie again. Perhaps this was due to the fact that Frankie had time to conclude that Gilbert probably wasn't the one who set him up. Gilbert's friends pitied him for this as they knew what really happened, but they themselves would be in danger if they told him what actually occurred. But Gilbert's memory was starting to come back to him little by little, but he couldn't quite understand what he was remembering, and this was concerning to Frankie. On July 21, 1992, 21-year-old Gilbert Camposano was offered a ride by some people he believed to be friends, and then as he exited the vehicle, he was shot 6 times and later died in the street.
On August 6, 1992, El Feo was released from the hospital in a wheelchair. But he wasn't deterred by his physical condition. In fact, he returned to his drug trade as determined as ever. He hired a chauffeur to take him around in a van specially customized for wheelchair access. He continued to oversee a number of spots in the Bronx and Washington Heights and supplied various different crews with work.
On August 14, 1992, government witness Michael Cruz was sitting in the passenger seat of a car in Brownsville, Brooklyn, where his family had recently been relocated to, when several armed men approached the vehicle and began firing shots at him. Michael was shot in the face and rushed to the hospital, but he survived the attack and later identified Lenny and Pac as the shooters.
A few days later, Lenny was spotted outside of 354 Cypress Ave and was chased through the building by Mark Tebbens and other officers. After a tussle with Tebbens, Lenny broke free and dove off of an interior second-level balcony onto the concrete floor below, injuring his knee, then disappeared into the complex.
Warrants were then issued for Lenny and Pac's arrests, but Pac was arrested 11 days after the shooting, but immediately made bail. After this, Lenny went off the grid and laid low for the coming months while wearing a brace on his knee.
Towards the end of the summer of 1992, detectives set up surveillance of the whole and had undercover officers buying red top crack. By this time, the Cowboys had stopped carrying guns in public due to the constant police pressure. Victor Mercedes, who was recently sent back to prison for an old case, was also indicted on charges.
Soon after this, Tesso was arrested and allegedly made statements implicating Pacualito and Papito's murder and named Lenny as the boss of the operation and Nelson as his second-in-command. He also stated that Jimmy Montalvo, who was called Fat Jimmy by the gang but nicknamed Heavy D by the police due to his resemblance to the rapper, was the general manager of Lenny's spots along with Frankie Robles and Russell Renny Harris.
Tesso provided information about the shooting of Frankie Cuevas, and when he mentioned a shadowy killer named Freddy Krueger, it was the first time police had heard the name, but they were now on a mission to locate him.
Police believed that former Red Top manager Freddy Sendra might be this mysterious Freddy Krueger, so they paid Sendra a visit in prison. When they met with Sendra, he denied being Freddy Krueger, but said he would give them anything they wanted to know about Lenny and Nelson since he felt betrayed by them. But Sendra was imprisoned while many of the notable events they wanted to know about had taken place, and the information he provided later turned out to be embellished or flat out false, just so he could get a deal. In mid-September 1992, Fat Danny made $250,000 bail to join Pacualito and Lenny on the streets. By the start of 1993, the investigation into the Wild Cowboys continued to advance, even though the process was being cheated by Tebbens' use of coached or paid-off eyewitnesses. At this point, the David Cargill homicide was still unsolved, but then Tito Cruz recently came forth and alleged to be a witness to that crime as well. He claimed to have been one of the drivers the night of Cargill's murder, but his version of events didn't match the crime scene details and vastly differed from other accounts. Little Iris, who was 13 years old at the time of the quad, gave a statement saying that she witnessed the killings and saw the faces of Fat Danny, Renny, Shorty, and Freddy Krueger from her 4th floor window at 10:30 at night.
There's also information which alleges that during this time, Mark Tebbens was having a sexual relationship with the underage Little Iris Cruz. In spite of the varying statements from the Cruz Morales family about who took part in the quad, it's widely believed that Freddy Krueger, Teso, and Platano were the only ones to actually fire guns into the alleyway at 320 Beekman.
On February 3rd, 1993, Lenny and Pac had court dates at the New York Criminal Courthouse right behind me at 100 Center Street in downtown Manhattan for charges stemming from a police chase 6 months earlier. Pac appeared for his hearing, but authorities thought that it was unlikely that Lenny would show up. But Lenny, believing that Manhattan Criminal Court wouldn't be in touch with the Bronx's 40th Precinct, actually did show up, and authorities were alerted.
When police approached Lenny, who was still wearing a leg brace, he tried to escape but was detained after a chase through the building and struggle with several detectives. Lenny was indicted along with Victor and Pac for the double homicide from 1989 and was also added in the indictment with Pac for the attempted murder of Michael Cruz.
By now, Frankie Cuevas was hunting down anyone who was with the Wild Cowboys.
On one afternoon, Frankie encountered Pacualito and other Cowboys members on 95th Street and Broadway in Manhattan, and he fired shots at Pac. As he was fleeing the scene, he was apprehended and arrested by police officers, but quickly made bail and returned to the streets.
Now both sides were moving around very cautiously and keeping an eye out for their enemies.
On June 20th, 1993, Pacualito was with El Feo in his van as his chauffeur drove them down West 177th Street heading to the West Side Highway. Just as they passed over Broadway, Pac spotted Frankie. He told the driver to pull over and the van stopped about halfway down 177th. Pac then pulled his gun and hopped out. He quickly crept up the sidewalk towards Frankie, who was in the street leaning against the driver's side window of a parked car, speaking to the occupants, which included his crime companion Manny Guerrero in the back seat. Pac then appeared in front of the car, coming face to face with Frankie. It's said that when Frankie saw Pac, he had a stunned and angry look on his face, seeming to be mad at himself for getting caught slipping, as he knew what was about to happen. Pac then began firing off shots at him. Manny couldn't pull his own gun in time and jumped out of the vehicle, getting shot by Pac as he took off running, while the driver quickly drove away but crashed into a nearby car. Startled by the commotion, El Feo's chauffeur began to drive away before Pac had even made it back, leading Pac to chase the van down and jump on the vehicle's rear ladder as they sped away. 30-year-old Franklin Frankie Cuevas died at the scene. The sinister, hell-raising bully who had terrorized the neighborhood for years and took advantage of anyone he could had finally been eliminated.
It's alleged that when word of Frankie Cuevas' death got around the neighborhood, there were people popping champagne in celebration. After the killing of Cuevas, Pacualito fled to the Dominican Republic.
On September 15, 1993, the walls came crashing down on the entire Wild Cowboys organization. 28 people were rounded up, joining those who were already in custody, and they were hit with a 58-count indictment, which included 10 charges of murder, conspiracy to traffic narcotics, assault, weapon possession, and engaging children under the age of 16 in criminal acts. After a nearly 8-year reign, the Wild Cowboys had been taken down.
When this major drug gang roundup made the news, the name the Wild Cowboys had appeared in print for the first time. The Spanish-language newspapers and press called them Los Vaqueros Salvajes. Up to that point, nobody in the gang had referred to themselves as that or had heard anyone else use it, but afterwards the name stuck and many members began using it to identify themselves.
In December of 1993, Lenny's lawyer told investigators he wanted to talk under the Queen for a Day agreement, which offers people immunity to not have their words later implicate them in court. Lenny confessed to murders that he was either directly involved in or had knowledge of.
But he was told that his full admission in the Cargill killing was required for them to accept any plea deal, to which he agreed.
The DA on the Cowboys case was Dan Brownell, and the judge was Leslie Crocker Snyder, who had presided over some big recent drug gang cases and was known to be hard on drug dealers. She was the judge on the case of the Jerry Curl gang, which was led by the 5 Martinez brothers and consisted of gang members who all wore the Jerry Curl hairstyle. They operated on West 157th Street in Washington Heights and ruled with extreme violence in the neighborhood. At the conclusion of the trial in April of 1993, the leader, Rafael Rafi Martinez, received 213 years in prison.
After it was uncovered that Pack and Nelson were in DR, Mark Tebbens reached out to an American DEA agent who was stationed there, and he helped coordinate their arrests with the Dominican task force. On March 24th, Pacolito was confronted by agents at an airport in Santo Domingo, and he pulled his gun as he attempted to flee, but he was restrained and arrested. On March 29th, he was flown back to New York, and that same day, agents located and arrested Nelson.
Soon after arriving in New York, Nelson began to cooperate with authorities.
On May 18, 1994, a date purposely chosen to commemorate the killing of David Cargill, Lenny confessed to his murder in a closed courtroom with the entire Cargill family present.
Heavy internal fighting between imprisoned gang members began occurring due to some taking exception with being accused of crimes that the other had committed. Fat Danny pressured Platano to leave him out of the quad murders and own up to his involvement, but he refused.
Then when Pack encountered Platano in the prison bullpen, he pummeled him for the initial statements he made to police.
As he was assaulting Platano, Nelson came to Platano's defense and swept Pack's leg from under him, then punched Pack in the face, which left his eye grotesquely swollen.
Fat Danny repeatedly pressed Tesso to fess up to the quad murder and to leave him out of it, and after failing to reason with him, Fat Danny gave him a vicious beatdown. At this juncture, Nelson's associates had yet to become aware that he had begun to cooperate against them. In addition to Nelson, several other Cowboys members had flipped, including George Seller Santiago, Francisco Frankie Robles, and Ciro Rodriguez. Seller and Frankie had said that they witnessed Victor and Pacolito commit the double murders of Tito and Chico from September of 1989, and Ciro implicated Danny and Linwood in 2 murders. As the trial date got nearer, several of the gang members charged with murder, who had initially made statements to police, refused to sign official contracts to cooperate and refused plea agreements. The 9 men accused of committing murders instead chose to stand trial.
Those who were charged with the 4 quad murders were Fat Danny, Platano, Stanley, Shorty, and Renny, in addition to having numerous other charges against them. Victor and Pacolito were charged with the double. Pac was charged with the murder of Frankie Cuevas. Linwood Collins was charged with murdering a man named Oscar Alvarez on the roof of a building on East 141st. Tesso was charged with the Brighton Beach murder of Papito along with Pac. Around the time that their trial was set to begin, they had learned for the first time that Lenny and Nelson had cut deals with the DA.
Overall, the DA had information linking the Wild Cowboys to at least 30 homicides, and a total of 41 people were indicted in the case. Judge Crocker Snyder had threatened several lower-level defendants to an automatic 25-year sentence unless they turned state's evidence. 9 other people who were charged with non-violent offenses such as drug dealing were also set to go on trial, but they all eventually settled on plea agreements, and all 9 copped out to varying sentences.
On September 7, 1994, in a courthouse full of extra armed security, 9 cowboys went on trial. Each defendant had their own lawyer, with all of them sitting across from each other at the same table. During this time, the DA had dozens of people testifying, including former gang members Freddy Sendra and Frankie Robles, undercover detectives, and numerous alleged eyewitnesses to the quad, including the Cruz Morales family. Frankie Cuevas' one-time crony Manny Guerrero also testified, implicating Pac in his murder.
Defense lawyers admitted that their clients were drug dealers, but argued against the conspiracy charges, alleging that the men were always together because they were childhood friends, but they were all involved in their own personal small-scale drug operations. They attacked the credibility of the testifying witnesses, most of whom had criminal records over drug dealers or drug users. They also pointed out the many discrepancies in the statements coming from Joey Morales and his siblings in relation to the quad. In October of 1994, Detective Mark Tebbens claimed that an inmate at Rikers Island told him that Paquolito offered him $30,000 to kill Lenny and Nelson, the witnesses on the trial, DA Dan Brownell, and Judge Crocker Snyder. Afterwards, Crocker Snyder was placed under 24-hour police protection. However, Pac's co-defendants and other people close to the case denied that such a plot ever took place and believed it to be yet another ploy conjured up by Tebbens.
In early 1995, Nelson pled guilty to manslaughter and conspiracy and received a sentence of 22 to life. In March, he was on the stand for a week, and while testifying, he avoided eye contact with the defendants.
The testimonies against the trial defendants coming from their former leaders, cohorts, and witnesses, both real and doctored, proved to be too strong for the jury. After an 8-month trial, on May 15, 1995, the jury reached their verdicts, and the defendants were found guilty on nearly every one of their respective charges.
On June 27, 1995, the 9 convicted trial defendants attended their sentencing hearings. Several of them took the opportunity to give statements.
I know that y'all prejudice me, you, the DA, the police, y'all prejudice me, sis, man. That's all I gotta say.
Russell Harris broke down in tears as he addressed the parents of quad victim Anthony Green, who had been his neighbors since childhood.
And I would like to let Mrs. Green and Mr. Green know that I did not kill their son or anybody else.
Daniel Gonzalez gave a statement in Spanish saying that this was a miscarriage of justice. Paquolito was defiant all the way through, showing up to the hearing in a black t-shirt with the skull graphic and even flipped off the news camera. Judge Leslie Crocker Snyder sentenced 24-year-old Stanley Tukes to 133 years in prison. 29-year-old Russell Renny Harris received 48 years in prison. 26-year-old Jose Paquolito Yaca received 116 years. 26-year-old Victor Mercedes received 66 years. 25-year-old Daniel Shorty Gonzalez received 141 years. 26-year-old Rafael Teso Perez got 50 years. 25-year-old Linwood Collins got 20 years. 30-year-old Wilfredo Platano de Los Angeles received 133 years. And 24-year-old Daniel Fat Danny Rincon received the longest sentence, 158 years in prison.
But there was one key man still on the run, Freddy Krueger. It wasn't until late 1994 that investigators had learned that Freddy Krueger was in fact Francisco Medina. By mid-1995, he had escaped to DR, where he allegedly supported himself by robbing banks and also kept up with his brujeria practice, and in May of 1996, he was added to the U.S. Marshals 15 Most Wanted list. Krueger's boss, El Feo, was now dealing with his own legal issues.
In December of the prior year, his prime drug spot at 1770 Andrews Avenue in the Bronx had been raided by authorities and numerous people were arrested, including his driver, Raul Vargas. El Feo was picked up while he was in Miami and was charged under the RICO statute with numerous counts, including racketeering and conspiring to kill 7 people. El Feo went on trial in April of 1996 with several people testifying against him, including his one-time apprentice, Raul Vargas. At the conclusion of the trial in early July, Jose El Feo Reyes was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Gun supplier and drug gang leader Raymond Polanco was also hit with a 13-count indictment, and Lenny testified at his trial. Polanco was ultimately convicted for his involvement in supplying Lenny with the gun used in the Cargill murder, as well as for conspiracy and drug trafficking counts, and received 5 consecutive life sentences plus 120 years.
Mark Tebbens would lend himself out to high-status drug dealers to benefit himself in some way down the line. One of them was Martin Mejias, known as Chango, the one-time co-leader of the Yellow Top Crew drug organization, which operated in the Manhattan Valley section of Manhattan. In 1996, Chango was rumored to be romantically involved with one of Tebbens' female supervisors in the HIU. Perhaps in an attempt to advance his own career, Tebbens developed a unique relationship with Chango and eventually came under his thumb.
He supplied Chango with various accommodations, such as day trips to see women while he was in jail at Rikers Island, and provided him with drugs to sell to inmates. U.S. authorities pressed the Dominican government to have Francisco Medina extradited, and even reached out to a Dominican newspaper to publish an article on him. Officials in DR began running surveillance on one of his religious sanctuaries, and on April 3, 1997, 15 officers stormed the site and took him in. By now, he had ballooned to over 300 pounds and appeared to be worn out by his life on the run. Medina was returned to the U.S. and charged with racketeering, cocaine trafficking, and 13 murders, although some estimates put his body count at nearly 3 times that. On July 23, 1998, he pled guilty to all charges and also admitted to being one of the quad shooters. Despite pleading guilty to 13 homicides, he was only sentenced to 50 years. He is presently 59 years old and is set to be released from prison in 2040, and if he makes it to the age of 75, he will get his freedom. If that happens, the witch doctor may credit his prayers as having worked in the long run. Robert Jackall, a professor of sociology who had spent time doing research at the 34th Precinct of Washington Heights in the early 90s, had been following the Wild Cowboys case since it began and sat on the bench with Justice Crocker Snyder for much of the trial. In 1997, Jackall published the book Wild Cowboys, Urban Marauders, and the Forces of Order. The book is largely comprised of details gleaned directly from law enforcement intelligence and official records, but it also contains a fair amount of fictionalization, since it retells stories from unreliable witnesses that have later proved to be embellished, inaccurate, or false. Additionally, it mentions several crimes that the HIU accused Cowboys members of, which they weren't actually responsible for, and relays unverifiable accounts from the Cruz Morales family. While Lenny did make initial statements about his cohorts, he never took the stand against anyone with the Wild Cowboys. On March 2, 1999, he was sentenced to 25 years to life. While El Feo was behind bars, he worked out a sentence reduction and was released in 2011 after spending 17 years in prison. On June 25, 2015, Detective Mark Tebbens committed suicide at the age of 55. It's alleged that a firearm was used. If he left a note, the contents of it have not been made public. In 2018, Victor Mercedes passed away after sustaining injuries from a prison fight. During the altercation, he hit his head on a concrete surface and lost consciousness and never woke up again. He was 50 years old. Nelson Sepulveda was released from prison in June of 2016 after serving around 17 years. Lenny was released in November of 2019 after serving a little over 20 years. The brothers are said to be living and working somewhere in New York City. Daniel Fat Danny Rincon continues to fight his conviction for the quad, and campaigns have been set up on his behalf. Benjamin Chubby Green, the older brother of Anthony Green, as well as Anthony's mother, both signed affidavits saying that they saw Danny elsewhere at the time of the quad murders. After Chango's release from a 15 to life sentence, he became involved in helping to free innocent people from prison, one of which is Danny Rincon. He has been interviewed by different integrity units about the illegal activities of the HIU and Tebbens, and to date, his efforts have helped to free 9 wrongfully convicted individuals from prison, although the information he's provided has the potential to overturn hundreds of convictions. Freddy Krueger and Rafael Perez confessed to being involved in the quad and have signed affidavits excluding Danny from any involvement in the killings. Platano has refused to confess to his involvement in the quad and has waived his right to parole hearings, allegedly stating that he is content to die in prison. Jose Pacuelito Yaca has been involved in motivational speaking from behind bars. He speaks of the ills of prison and encourages the youth to not go down the same path that he did.
I've been in prison for over 30 years. I got a question. Do you want to spend the rest of your life in prison? Please put down the guns. I guarantee you, I promise you, that this is not the life that you want to live.
If there's a such thing as the perfect prototype for a drug gang, perhaps the Wild Cowboys were it. Prosperous, powerful, feared, and deadly, they ran a secretive and secured operation backed by a squad of dangerous hitmen and were led by a formidable and intelligent leader who was schooled by one of the most successful kingpins of all time. Although downfall is inevitable for every drug gang, the Wild Cowboys likely would have lasted longer and suffered much less severe consequences had they kept the violence to necessary business matters. Lenny shooting and killing a random kid on the highway and Nelson having 4 innocent people slaughtered deviated too far from the script and motivated law enforcement to bring them down in any way possible, even with the use of tactics which were just as nefarious as the criminals that they were after. As usual, when the unit is taken down, people begin to unravel. Leaders turn on their underlings and friends cooperate against each other. Sentences handed out to the 9 trial defendants combined for a total of 868 years, but had it not been for the quad, many of them would have been released from prison already. Whatever the case, the crew of Dominican kids from Washington Heights who took over territory in the South Bronx and came to be known as the Wild Cowboys have gone down in history as one of the most lethal and notorious criminal organizations to ever run the streets of New York City.